was the time, the period before social change had taken place.
Race films showed us what people could do with little.
The problems that they went through just to sort of get these films made and edited and produced is really extraordinary.
What these people did in the face of great adversity, I think it should be a source of encouragement and inspiration.
This was a remarkable thing, part of a black industry we didn't know existed.
We used all colored people, and I loved it because it was a breakthrough for us.
The idea of a black filmmaker was so exciting in terms of the possibilities.
We saw cowboys, we saw gangsters, we saw comedy, we saw musicals. People had an escape.
Something of their stories, their lives were up on the screen.
They were wonderful, but who bothered to write it down?
Knowledge of the race movie era has disappeared.
I think we need to know that there's a history.
There will never be a comparable era where blacks will have the full range of roles and possibilities and involvements in the cinema industry that the race movie represented.
People had dreams, and the dreams could come true.
Nothing can stop us now.
Dorothy Dandridge, Paul Robeson, Cab Calloway, Lena Horne. We think of them as Hollywood legends. But these stars and scores of other black entertainers during the first half of the 20th century began their careers in the shadow of Hollywood, during a time when the mainstream movie industry refused to cast blacks except in roles of servitude or ridicule. An artistic underground was developing to counter the negative depiction of African Americans in film. They were called race movies, featuring all-black cast and made exclusively for all-black audiences. It was the beginning of something we now know as independent film, and its pioneers would pave the way for generations of African-American performers, filmmakers, and their audiences. This is the story of those pioneers.
The golden age of race movies were the 1930s and the 1940s, and they were movies that were made specifically for a black viewing audience. The need for that was created by the segregated nature of American society. In the silent era, there was a tradition of presenting the black experience in a very negative way. That tradition was inherited from some of the entertainment forms of the 19th century, but included portraying blacks in essentially a very narrow range of negative racial stereotypes. And so the early cinema industry is remarkable for the limitations and, to a degree, the degrading way in which the black culture and the black experience was presented.
When you look at the paucity of images that were available in the 20s and 30s, you had 2 or 3 archetypes. There was the maid, there was the buffoon, there was the mammy. It was very limited.
During that period of time, African Americans were limited to the type of roles that they were given, acting in a servitude way and taking away from the dignity of a human being.
The first big cinema blockbuster film that really transformed the industry was a film called Birth of a Nation that was released in 1915. The nation that was being born was the Ku Klux Klan, and it became quite a controversial issue in terms of the race relations of that period and every generation that came along afterwards. The producer and director of that film, D.W. Griffith, was a complex man. On one level, he was a cinematic genius, perhaps the first in the industry. But at the same time, he possessed that kind of artistic genius. He was raised in that tradition of race in which blacks were supposed to be subordinate and supposed to be defined by this pattern of racial stereotypes. That combination of artistry and racism was going to define the industry well into the middle of the 20th century.
The Birth of a Nation was Hollywood's sort of like landmark film. And the president of the United States says of Birth of a Nation, it's like writing history in lightning. And there are an inordinate number of people who accepted Birth of a Nation as history.
The attempt was made to answer the messages of Birth of a Nation with films that presented a more positive and a more comprehensive view of the black experience. Probably the most important early response was a film created by Emmett Scott, who had been the secretary of Booker T. Washington, called Birth of a Race. And it met with very little success economically or in terms of its artistic content. But it was a legitimate attempt to respond cinematically to, that Birth of a Nation experience.
There were a number of other companies that surfaced during this period. The earliest that we have information on is Lincoln Pictures. Not very much of their work has survived.
They weren't going to be films that would be preserved by the Smithsonian Institution or preserved in the vaults of the major Hollywood studios. And if blacks were going to be active in the cinema of the golden age of Hollywood, they were going to be servants, or they were going to be tap dancers, or they were going to be very overt villains that would be threats to civilization, if not American culture.
There was a certain way you had to behave to get in one of the movies that Hollywood would make. They were racist movies. Uftar, we called it. If you could demonstrate cleverly inferiority.
People of our generation often wonder why black actors and actresses would play the demeaning roles that were imposed on them by Hollywood.
Is that you, Matthew?
Yes, ma'am, Miss Kay. This is Matthew. I brought the trunks and the boxes, but Mr. Frank said the car didn't come on the train.
Oh. Well, put them in the guest house, as I told you.
Oh, yes, ma'am, but I have to have some help. They're amazingly heavy.
Then get some of the other boys to help you.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Come on. Come on.
I think Hattie McDaniel had the most appropriate and famous response. She said she basically had two choices. She could either be a maid for $5 a week or play a maid in a movie for $5,000 a week.
The black folk, we were known as Negroes then, didn't have major roles. I enjoyed seeing those that I did see because at least we got to see some of us in the movies,
What the race movie did was to give a Hattie McDaniel or a Lincoln Perry, also known as Stepin Fetchit, the opportunity to play other roles and to move beyond the limitations that the mainstream industry would place upon them.
We did analyze what we did very, very much to make sure there was nothing in there that made our comedians look like they were stupid people without education.
Black people wanted to see black heroes on the screen. They wanted to see dramatic presentations of the possibilities of black life on the screen. And that's what cinema could give any audience, and that's what race movies gave to the black audience.
Look down, look down, that lonesome road before you travel alone.
There was a market that opened up, and it was a reality that there was a lot of money in this market, just devoted almost exclusively to race audiences.
We wanted to identify the pictures as colored Western pictures. And we used all colored people. They were different shades. So if you look at the pictures, they were in black and white, but you will see a vast difference in some of my actors in there. And so that's the way our advertisement went out, and I demanded it. If you look at the advertisement on my pictures back to 36, you will see all colored cast. And I loved it because it was a breakthrough for us.
All I knew is the idea of a black filmmaker was so exciting to me in terms of the possibilities.
They showed us different phases of African American life. We saw cowboys, we saw gangsters, we saw comedy, we saw musicals, we saw different parts of the country. People had an escape.
We were glad when the Negro audience got the opportunity to be portrayed in their real life.
They were films that made our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents happy.
In the climate of segregation, race movies had little difficulty finding an audience. But it would take an auteur of immense talent and creative energy to make race movies more than just a passing experiment.
Oscar Micheaux was probably the most important pioneer in black filmmaking. Micheaux started his artistic career as a literary figure, writing several novels, but he had uneven success with the novels and decided that perhaps by translating them into cinema, he would be more successful.
Oscar Micheaux was a filmmaker for about 30 years, writing his own films, distributing them, directing them, and casting his own pictures. He made more than 40 films in that career.
He had lived in South Dakota as a young man and went there as a farmer and rancher. He was the only African American in South Dakota at that time living out in Gregory, and it's just land there and a little house there. So that made him sort of unique and unusual.
His first film, The Homesteader, is based pretty much on his life as a homesteader and the people who surrounded him in that part of the country. He was very attached to the land because land was independence. It gave him, as to many blacks at that period, a sense of reality of their independence and their freedom.
Micheaux had a certain vision and certain ideas about what was good and bad as far as race was concerned, and you could see that in his films. In 1919, he released a film called Within Our Gates, which artistically speaking, and in terms of its kind of power and its later influence as a piece of cinema, was going to be a much more effective response to Birth of a Nation.
What Micheaux does in Within Our Gates, he unmasks the Klan. Nobody was safe from being lynched. And Micheaux shows the lynching in such a dramatic way. You see the rope, you see them struggling with the family. There was the mother, the father, and the kid who were about to be lynched. So telling that story to his audiences is like putting truth to the lies that were told, because the white press didn't often cover lynchings. They may have said a man was lynched, but they gave no identity. But the black press not only gave identity, but talked about the people's work lives, who they were, and identified them, their age, and the circumstances under which their lives were taken.
In his film Within Our Gates, very directly, you can find parallel scenes in which he is responding to messages and images that Griffith created a few years before.
In Birth of the Nation, of course, you've got a black man raping a white woman. Oscar Micheaux was trying to say that this white man was so perverted that he was going to rape his own daughter. You know, the fact that she was his child, and that's the only thing that stopped him finally.
He made more films than anyone else during this period, and so more of his films have survived. He's one of the few to make it from the silent era into the sound era.
It can't be true.
A friend of ours mentioned the fact that there was a movie being made in Chicago, and it was going to be all African Americans, everybody in it, and the film by African Americans. And so a group of us went over to where he was interviewing people for jobs. And I was standing in line, and a young man came up and said, would you come with me? So he took me into a room, and I saw a gentleman sitting at the end of the table, and he was middle-aged, slightly salt and pepper hair, and I knew immediately that was Oscar Micheaux. He handed me a manuscript. When he first handed it to me, I thought it was a telephone book. It was so big and thick. And so I started reading, and he said, well, now stop and go back to this page, and he had me read different pages. And finally, he turned to his wife, and he said, Ellis, I think this is the one. And he said, would you like to be in a movie and read the star role? I was flabbergasted. I said, yes, yes, yes.
In many ways, Micheaux was representative of the whole race movie industry, operating essentially on the fringes of mainstream cinema, often with very little money and often relying upon his own skills and talents and energy for almost every aspect of film production and distribution.
I remember one particular incident. He wanted to get the cameraman to shoot some pictures of the homes along the way there. We can use that as exterior shots, he said. And there were people looking out of their windows saying, who are all these people? So he would say, listen, get out of the way. I'm shooting a picture. And we would look at him and say, what is he? These people live in those homes. That's there. And he's telling them to get out of the window, get out of the way. Can't you see I'm shooting a movie? So we would sort of snickle and laugh because nobody wanted to laugh in front of him because he was a very feared character there.
Micheaux was a big man. He was over 6 feet tall and with a hefty build. He could be a tyrant, but on the other hand, there are stories about Micheaux as a sort of gentle giant.
A lot of us were amateurs, and we were anxious to get started, and he would tell the actors and actresses what to do, where to stand.
Oscar Micheaux would be responsible for every aspect of getting the film made and distributed, sometimes going as far as to have copies of the film that he would drive around in the trunk of his car to a different, a different menu of cities.
When his health finally did give out in 1950 and 51, he was on the road promoting his film. The mystery about Micheaux's death, because he didn't have a headstone on his grave, and I guess for a while people didn't know where he was buried, because when he died, the word is that his wife became a kind of recluse, and she was very close to Micheaux, his lifetime partner. And she had a nervous breakdown, and she was institutionalized. But his passion for filmmaking sort of grew naturally out of his passion for, he was a storyteller. And it's because he made so many films that he gives us a legacy.
While Oscar Micheaux was the most prolific filmmaker of the race movie era, he was by no means the only one. Spencer Williams, who would later achieve notoriety as Andy in television's Amos and Andy, began his career as a race film director, producer, and actor.
In contrast to an Oscar Micheaux, a filmmaker like Spencer Williams was not adverse to producing cinema that simply entertained. And in the 1930s, he did some films with Herb Jeffries, for example, some westerns where he played traditional villain roles.
He was a very good friend of mine and helped me a lot in the films, Spencer Williams. But for him to be the villain heavy in the movies, it does make it hard for you to have fight scenes and dislike a guy you like a lot.
What's the big idea, fella? If you didn't have that gun, I'd show you.
He was a wonderful man. I liked him, and he was a genius. He really was.
He'll never be as well known as Oscar Micheaux, but in terms of representing what the race movie industry was as a part of the larger industry, he's probably much more symbolic and representative.
In the nearly 500 race movies produced between the 19-teens to the 1940s, scores of actors would grace the screen. Many would be forgotten, but some would endure. Perhaps the greatest race film star of the silent era was stage and screen actress Evelyn Prier.
My mother, Evelyn Prier, starred in 11 movies for Oscar Micheaux. She was a quick study, and he said always willing to go over and beyond what she was asked to do in a role.
Micheaux could sell his pictures just based on her.
Big names talked about her talent, and one actress even said there would have been nobody after Evelyn Prier if it hadn't been for Evelyn Prier. So the fact that she opened the doors without even knowing that she was opening them or even intending to. When my mother first announced that she was pregnant, article in the paper titled, "Evelyn Prier Awaits Visit of Stork." And they said, well, what are you having, Miss Prier? Oh, she said, it's a girl, and I'm going to make her an actress. This is her last photo. She went to have this picture taken on a Saturday afternoon after having stood in the rain for a long time, and so was very wet by the time she reached the studio, and very flushed and feverish. And the photographer said, Miss Prier, you don't have to stay. We can do this another day. He fixed a stool for her to lean on, and what looks like a curtain behind her is really a wall, and you can tell she's leaning on that wall. This was a Saturday afternoon. She died Thursday. But I treasure that because it is the last picture that was taken of her. I don't think my father ever got over the fact that she died 7 months after I was born. I knew, of course, that she had died of pneumonia. I knew about how fast it had gone. I think one newspaper article said she came to once and asked, where's my baby? I want to think that she would have, could have done more, and would have and could have been seen by a larger audience.
What you often see when you look at the race movies are opportunities for black actors and actresses who have a very limited field of possibilities in the major studio productions to stretch and display the talents and the abilities that they have on a much wider stage, so to speak. Nina Mae McKinney was a light-skinned, talented black movie star of the 1920s and 30s who found it difficult to find roles in the mainstream industry. And because of that, she was available for race movie work, and that was a common kind of pattern that you would see.
She was dubbed the Black Greta Garbo, wonderful actress.
Now I'm no black door woman, or with no black door man. I don't do no loving, or no part-time playing.
Anita Mae McKinney would be a talented actress who was stunted and whose career was suppressed essentially by the lack of opportunities in the mainstream industry. And race movies for her were both a release and an opportunity and really a salvation for a career that, that could have been much more had she been white or had the industry been different.
To escape the misery of the Great Depression, black audiences in the 1930s flocked to upbeat musicals. One of the greatest musical stars of the era was the charismatic Cab Calloway.
Cab Calloway didn't really need race movies or didn't need cinema at all. Cab Calloway was one of the biggest musical celebrities, stars of his generation. Of course, when you reach that level, then you're going to take advantage of all the opportunities that are presented to you. So Cab Calloway was essentially a music star, but that music star celebrity translated well into the race movie industries, and a number of vehicles were made just so that Cab Calloway could sing and dance for the race movie audience. Sometimes race movies might have plots that were fairly predictable, fairly weak, and maybe even unimportant, but what race movies did were provide opportunities for the big black stars of the day to connect with the black audiences of the day, and Cab Calloway's career was a perfect example of that.
Cab, can't you see that gal is a first-class moocher?
She's not the moocher. It's you, Minnie. Yes, my dear, you, Minnie the moocher.
I had been admiring him since I had been able to go to the shows in Chicago there. And I would go watch him, and of course I would imitate him, and of course all the things that was wonderful about him. So my being selected to work with him was Cab Calloway. I mean, goodness gracious, you know. So I worked with him, and he was just a dreamboat. It was just wonderful. And he had promised that in the future that we would probably maybe do some things together, but I got a chance to go different ways, and so I never did, other than just that one movie. But they show it all the time now, you know, and I get people who have seen it say, well, about 2 years ago, a man came up to me and he says, you know, I saw that movie of yours with Cab Calloway, and when he hit you, he says, did you bleed?
I'll see you dead before I let anyone take you from me.
I said, no, it wasn't quite that hard, but it was, you know, it looked like he had knocked me out, really.
Jenny Ligon, she was the first African-American woman to have a contract with a major Hollywood studio. She starred in a lot of films, danced with Bill Robinson, Bojangle.
I couldn't imagine having a chance to dance with him, because, you know, he was considered the king of dance at that time.
Got a handful of nothing.
Why, you originally there?
But I want you like a home. Well, I'm doing okay, living in a great big way.
Tell that to the landlord.
I'm the salt in the ocean, I'm the sun way up in the sky. I'm Franklin D. Roosevelt. I'm $1 million long as I got left in my fingers, rhythm in my voice. Got the devil's his way, living in a great big way.
Jenny currently is living in Canada, but she still dances and tours the United States, talking about her film and talking about dance.
Did you hear what the lady said?
While she made her career in Hollywood films, actress Fredi Washington, a fair-skinned black woman with green eyes, was noted for turning down numerous offers to pass for white.
Fredi Washington was, again, a light-skinned black actress of the 1920s and 30s. She's probably best known for the work she did with the film Imitation of Life, where she played a very frustrated, a very repressed daughter of a dark-skinned mother who was struggling with the issues of the color line and whether she should try to pass for white.
Oh, I know it's terrible of me, Miss B. But you don't know what it is to look white and be black. You don't know.
The one I remember the most was Imitation of Life. Because of the culture then, most people thought it was more beautiful to be fair-skinned with straight hair.
I think Fredi Washington really never got the acknowledgement that she deserved as an actress. Most people know her as Fiona in Imitation of Life. But she starred in films before then. She was in The Emperor Jones with Paul Robeson, but because she was so fair, the censors made them put makeup on her skin. And for years, I didn't know who she was in the film. I was always looking for her because of her skin color. They had to darken her up.
Some people might mistake her for a white lady, and having a romantic encounter with Paul Robeson was simply going to be unacceptable in the 1930s, and so they made her wear dark makeup in that film. And so if you were a black actress aspiring to be involved in that industry of that day, those were the kind of compromises that you sometimes had to accept.
She was too light to be black in films with black actors. Paul Robeson was a mighty, mighty, mighty actor. And although he didn't star in that many all-black cast films, you know, he made his mark in them. Body and Soul was Oscar Micheaux film. It was probably one of the most controversial film that Micheaux did because it was about a minister, evil minister. Probably the best one is The Emperor Jones because his voice in films, you know, carried the films.
It was wonderful knowing him and being in his presence because he was a big star at that time. And I hadn't done too badly. And so he would take me out and we'd go to a restaurant and the people would mob him. Oh, it was just grand.
That talent and other reasons, he was able to rise to the level of stardom in spite of being dark-skinned in the context of his time and place.
Paul Robeson's public life was surrounded by controversy. During the early Cold War years of the 1940s and 50s, he was an open advocate for the Soviet Union, and Joseph Stalin in particular, and his actions effectively put an end to his film career in America.
He never really got accolades that he deserved. And during his life, he was a man who fought for what he believed in, and he stood up for what he said.
Don't know why there's no sun up in the sky, stormy weather, since my man and I ain't together. Keeps raining all the time.
Today you say, well, Lena Horne, of course she's a star, but she wasn't a star in the 1920s, and to a degree, the race movies were the doorway through which she was able to move into the industry. And once she moves into the industry, then being Lena Horne, she's going to be noticeable. She's going to rise to a level of stardom, even in the majority culture perspective. But it is a race movie in many ways that made her career.
We will be the tops, just wait and see.
Lena Horne would probably not have been Lena Horne without her race movie work.
Lena Horne, one of my great friends, dear, 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 dear friend. And I think she was one of the most beautiful women of all women that I've ever seen in my life. She had a great talent, a great unique ability to create a style.
Lena Horne was a beautiful, beautiful actress and singer. She starred with Ralph Cooper in The Duke is Top, but after her performance in the film, they later changed the title of the film to The Bronze Venus, giving her top billing.
Lena Horne is a natural. Lena Horne would be a movie star if movies didn't exist. She's the kind of personality and the kind of attractive and powerful figure that inspires that kind of emotion in a person whenever you experience her.
I know you remember.
One of the biggest stars of the race movie era was a man named Herb Jeffries. And one of the reasons he was a big star was because he was active in probably the most popular genre of the race movie era. He made black westerns. He was a black western hero along the lines of a Gene Autry or a Roy Rogers. And westerns were a popular form of movie making at that time.
With my rope and my saddle and my horse and my gun, I'm a happy cowboy.
If I'm riding in my saddle and I'm always on the run, I'm a happy cowboy. What I saw when I traveled to the South was the American Negro. He would be just crowded under the streets looking at white cowboy pictures. Buck Jones, Tom Mix, they would fill the street up waiting for the theater to turn out. Little tin roof theater, maybe 200 people, something like that. And I was impressed by it. I went into a diner one day and picked up a magazine there, and I saw the name of a guy by the name of Jed Buell, an Irishman. And he was thinking about making a picture called The Terror of Tiny Town. When I saw that in the magazine, I said, this guy will make the Terror of Tiny Town, which were all little people, what we call today. We don't use the word midgets anymore. We use little people.
I want you to go up to North Fork Range, see what's wrong up there. What do you think's wrong? I don't know. I was up through there the other day, and there ain't hardly a calf on the range. And I
said, if he'll do that, he'll make an all-colored cowboy picture. I'd spent 2 years talking to different people with money, and nobody was interested. And when I saw that, I said, this guy will go. And in 15 minutes, he was ready. He called his distributor in Dallas, Texas. The distributor was Al Sachs Company, who were distributing for all of the Gene Autry films and things. And he said, I'll take all you got. How many you got? And we had nothing. I had no knowledge of the motion picture business, only I just had an idea. And, of course, this man thought I did, and he said, who's going to write the script? And I just looked down and I saw a bunch of scripts laying down by his desk, and I reached in and picked one of them up, and it had on there, Sunset on the Prairie. And I said, why don't we call it Harlem on the Prairie and use this script?
He was an especially important figure in terms of the black viewing audience because all of the very positive attributes and characteristics that could be attached to a male cowboy hero were now being attached to a black cowboy hero. And so you open up the possibilities of re-examining the whole history of the American West.
1 out of every 3 cowboy who helped to set up the boundary lines of our states going west was colored. By colored, I mean a Negro. What a great feeling of accomplishment it is. I never thought in a million years that at 90 years old, I would be on the Walk of Fame in Hollywood. Right now, I'm celebrating a vintage of 94.
Before he was a movie star, he was a singer with Father Hines. Later went on to sing with Duke Ellington, still sings. But in the 30s, he was the Bronze Buckaroo, the first African-American cowboy in film.
So when the day's ended, with a setting sun, a happy cowboy's word is gone.
All right.
Dorothy Dandridge is considered by many to be the greatest black star that emerges from the race movie industry. She starts in the industry as a very young girl in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and that's how she gets involved in the cinema industry.
I want a brown gown with a zop top with a hip slip, a lace waist in the sharpest taste. See my Sunday man, I want a scat hat with a trim brim, a zag bag with a rip zip to look plenty hip. See my Sunday Sam. Yes.
She really grows her career as well as, in terms of her own life. She grows in the industry until when we get to the 1950s, she is a full-blown star, but essentially with nowhere to go. Because unlike some of the earlier light-skinned actresses of the 1930s and 40s, like Nina Mae McKinney or Freddie Washington, by the time that Dorothy Dandridge is ready for adult stardom, the race movie industry has ended. Her biggest film comes along in 1954 in Carmen Jones. But after Carmen Jones is done, what do you do with an actress like Dorothy Dandridge? The mainstream industry doesn't have anything to do with her. She has a very sporadic career and very difficult time finding appropriate roles after Carmen Jones. But in the 1950s, had there been a race movie industry, she would have plenty of work to do. And so that's one of the things that kind of distinguishes her career, tragically so, from the careers of earlier black actresses that came before her.
Dorothy was a dear friend of mine. She would always call me for advice. Loved her. And I wondered oft times why she passed away so quickly. Another great gifted woman, a gift by God.
Tremendous talent, tremendous presence, tremendous, gifts, cinematic gifts to offer to the audience, but no roles that she can play that are acceptable to the industry in the 1950s and early 60s. So eventually that catches up with her, and she commits suicide in the early 1960s. Midnight Ramble was a term that was often applied to when black viewers were able to watch some of these race movie productions. Sometimes it meant that in a particular theater, there was only one day of the week that a black audience might be able to watch some black reference themes. And in other cases, it meant that there were certain times of the day or night that would be reserved for a black audience. And I think that's where the phrase Midnight Ramble comes from. Often blacks would have to wait until after other theater patrons were no longer going to be using that theater to watch some of these race movies.
In the white theaters, it was after the regular shows, so they had special showings, and they had midnight rambles from midnight to 2. But in the South and the colored-owned theaters, they had movie houses set up almost anywhere, so they weren't like we think movie houses where they could be a storefront or, a tin shack.
It matters not if I shall play for the people of the world. There's a kinship tonight that strikes here, that will live forever in my memory. Something that only you and I can understand.
You usually were with groups, and so it was your neighbors, your friends. And it made you want to dress up. It made you want to be beautiful. It made you want to be talented.
These are the audiences that really counted in terms of race movies because they still wanted to see themselves up on the screen.
Like the black church, the black theater, particularly the black-owned theater, but a place of community pride. Majority of the theaters that were black-owned or black-run were named after black heroes, like the Douglas Theater or Lincoln or Carver and Dunbar, named after black heroes. So they were places of pride.
Midnight Rambles became events, communal experiences that bonded audiences and gave extra meaning to the images they coveted on the screen. Images that would soon be lost to time.
Many of the race movies were lost, and we simply don't have access to them today because of the way that they were made and the audience that they sought. And I think probably more than anything else, it's the marginalization of the people who made the films as well as the people who viewed them that has made them so hard to come by today.
The films were not preserved. They were just discarded. That's why in past years people were finding them, in basements and old barns in different countries and stuff, anywhere, They were just discarded. Now it's a race to find these films and to try to restore those, that are restorable.
In Tyler, Texas, we're probably a town that's as proud of its history as any place you can find, and those of us who are trying to save it are very alert to anything new and different that turns up. So it was a topic of conversation when in 1983 some black films starring black people, made by black people, produced and directed and financed by black companies, turned up in a warehouse of the Roost Company.
There was a lot of interest generated by the press around this collection of films. It went out on the wires across the country, and the numbers game changed from 100, 80, 70. So we really didn't know how many films were in that collection.
It was a mystery as to how these films turned up in Tyler, because we seemed to have no actual connection to the production of the film, but to find something seemingly unrelated to us was really a strange, where did they come from?
Back in the early 70s, my father-in-law asked me to go to Dallas to tear a building down. I stumbled in a dusty, dark warehouse, a film storage facility for some distributor.
That would be the Al Sack, Sack Amusement Enterprises down on Film Row. And Al, being a distributor to small, independent black theaters in the South, recognized a need for films that would be attractive to that audience.
We stumbled across these canisters, and to my surprise, they were black and white films. I took some of the film outside to look at it, and based on what I was reading in their titles, I thought they were pornographic-type films. And we took some to the city dump. I saved the canisters because at that time I thought they would be great for storage of shotgun shells, ammunition, whatever. So I took the reels out and threw them away. About halfway through this, there were so many of them, and I said, well, let's just take some to our warehouse in Tyler. This is the BM&R warehouse where the Tyler Black Film Collection finally ended up. And I put them in this corner for about 10 years. They stayed right here.
I mean, this is like a missing chapter. This here is at least 40 or 50 race movies, intact, 35mm prints.
Wake up, won't you? Come on, son. Come on, don't you hear me? This is your pappy talking to you. Wake up, will you? Oh, wake up. Little Joshua. Little Joshua. Wake up. Wake. Oh, Lord. Lord, have mercy. Don't take it from me. Have mercy, Lord.
I'm remorse that I did not save all of the films that I'd come across, because now I understand they were the lost films of that particular era, that most of them had been destroyed. And here I had it in my hands, but did not realize what I had.
The minute parts of that collection began to be restored and written about, scholars and others began to realize that there were some very important films in this collection. Murder in Harlem is one classic example of the show film that surfaced in this collection. So for different aspects of the study of black cinema, this cachet is very important. For aspects of that missing chapter in American film history, this cachet is very important because it not only brings back to life films, the actual films, but also what the achievements were and how people saw themselves.
This is a rare photograph of the Howard Theater in Washington, D.C. in the early 1900s. This is the Howard Theater as it exists today.
There are probably several reasons that the knowledge of the race movie era has disappeared. In the 1950s, when the country pursued the concept of racial integration, that really was the primary sociological movement that meant that the race movie era would end. And on the white side of the line, the race movie was never going to be a well-known commodity simply because it wasn't targeted at that audience. But even on the black side of the color line, after the course of some time, even the memory of that industry would fade.
The demise of race movies, well, first of all, the black press was much more interested in what was going on in Hollywood and the careers of blacks working in Hollywood, because that's where, according to the press of the moment, where real films were made. Hollywood became a goal for an aim and an ambition for a lot of talent. There was little interest in making and continuing to make race movies. Hollywood would come out with these big musicals that cost a fortune, and Micheaux would come out with something like Swing. Even though he had talent in it, he couldn't. The audiences would prefer to go to see the big musicals that a lot of money and the glamour and whatnot.
They were making all-black cast films like Stormy Weather, Cabin in the Sky.
There were occasional all-black casts that were produced and distributed, like Carmen Jones in 1954 or Porky and Bess later in that decade. But by and large, a young black man was not going to see many positive images of the black experience if they went to the cinema.
We integrated, and of course, the black theater lost its audience because now we can go downtown. It affected movie going in the black theater the same way that it affected businesses and restaurants that were owned by blacks.
One of the byproducts of integration, although it certainly had to happen, was that when you were free of that confinement and you could go anywhere you wanted to, well, it was a novelty of we're going to go everywhere. And so you then abandon those institutions that were maintained, let's face it, over 100 years almost in some of these neighborhoods where you were confined. And there's something to me that's lost. There's a huge vacuum of history that's lost when you tear down the places where they played. The grandeur of the theaters, the amount of time and attention and the care and the detail that went into making them, you could not rebuild a theater like this for under $50 million today. This theater being open, the lights being on at night, it means something.
It gives me a good feeling to come back. Just being here and looking around and bringing back memories, and it's so gorgeous. It's so gorgeous. I never realized it was this pretty.
It's impossible to bring it back. And as a matter of fact, I don't think I would want to bring it back like it was. I've lived that once. You can't stand in time. You have to move on.
I remember doing a film with Sidney Poitier called No Way Out, and it was a film about racism, but Sidney was a doctor, and he was just doing a stand-up role as a doctor.
By 1950, blacks gradually began getting the kinds of roles in Hollywood films that they'd strived for over 40 years. And while the race movie era was over, its influence had just begun. Black filmmakers and screen stars of today can trace their roots to an obscure figure living on a windy South Dakota prairie.
When Micheaux got the star on Hollywood and Vine, it was much deserved. And it's a pity that it happened after he died, that Hollywood would recognize him. And the irony is that all of this talent was there, and it was not until the star was placed on Hollywood and Vine that people began to pay attention to who this man was. And it isn't simply about the numbers of films he made, it was how he made them and how he was able to make films like Within Our Gates within a very, very small budget. You know, I mean, it's like talking to today's independent filmmakers, that you can make a feature and it can be a hit. It can win all kinds of accolades, and it didn't cost a fortune to make.
When you look back on it, it's really a kind of a genius. You know, the problems that they went through just to sort of get these films made and edited and produced is really extraordinary.
I think the race movie does create the model for independent filmmaking. In the early 70s, the profits that were generated by the new wave of black films in many ways had a lot in common with the films of the race movie era. You know, in the early 90s, many of the hood films were made by unknown black directors and black producers. You know, many of the pathways that we see independent filmmakers taking into the industry today had been pioneered by those people in the race movie era.
Spike Lee is standing on the shoulders of Oscar Micheaux. Without Micheaux, there really could be no Spike Lee, no Kevin Sullivan, no anybody else that came after them.
Spike Lee, he was determined to do film, much like Micheaux, I guess. When he asked us to be in Do the Right Thing, I was so excited to be working for Spike Lee. I thought he was a boy when I first met him. He just looked like he might have been 19 or 20. And he was making his movies by any means necessary.
Black film history didn't just start with Spike Lee and John Singleton. I mean, we go back to Foster and Micheaux and Spencer Williams and a whole host of pioneers.
We're trying to keep this history alive. I mean, it is a struggle and a battle to bring the history back to where it should be so that people will know what these beginnings are and what they were, thereby bringing the community and this humanity together.
I think there will never be a comparable era where blacks will have the full range of roles and possibilities and involvements in the cinema industry that the race movie represented.
I think race films are a legacy that we need to preserve, mainly because they showed us what people could do with little.
I think that there has been a real resurgence of interest in that era.
I say this, if I go tomorrow, boy, it was good.
Quite an experience for one to have if one is lucky enough to come that way and have it.
I'll tell you, it's wonderful to be alive and be in a museum and still be alive. That's the best part of it, you know.